All right, we are live. Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today we're going to have a little discussion about the principle of simple uniformity. Now, before we kind of explain what the principle says, I guess I want to first clarify how we were able to come up with the principle. So there's a book. Well, actually, I'm sure most of you probably know him. He's probably my favorite atheist philosopher. His name is Graham Oppy. I've read Argument About Gods here. And then I also read another book, which is called The Best Argument Against God. Now, this book actually really helped me develop the principle because when I read it, I realized as I was reading through the material that he's actually not wrong in what he says, right? And I think it's important to help clarify those sort of things. So I guess a few things we should start off with understanding is number one, what's called theoretic virtues, right? And these theoretic virtues come in different forms, but basically the four theoretic virtues that he talks about in his book is basically the principle of simplicity, principle of simplicity, which is basically that you must have a simple hypothesis, right? And then also he talks about explanatory power, so your hypothesis must be able to explain things, right? And it also must have explanatory scope, which means it has to explain all data. And it also has to have predictability, which is it has to predict certain things within nature. So I guess you can kind of put, besides simplicity, I guess you can kind of put explanatory power into one, just, having explanatory power in your theory, right? But you also want simplicity in the hypothesis, right? Now, I'm going to try my best to go over the sort of arguments that he used. Now, I want to clarify, he didn't actually present like an argument with premises in the book, right? What he did instead was he kind of went over and he compared theism with naturalism with these theoretic virtues. And basically, this is basically, I guess, his argument in a nutshell. So he goes over different phenomena, like he goes over fine-tuning, consciousness, morality, different sort of arguments for God that people talk about, right? And he basically shows that the naturalist is able to explain those things by what's called brute facts. So basically, it's just a brute fact that the universe is fine-tuned, or it's a brute fact that the universe is applicable, or mathematics is applicable to the universe. And he applies this sort of brute fact idea to pretty much almost everything, right? And I also want to clarify that another, I guess, related thing to brute facts would be necessities, right? So let's say if you don't want to violate the PSR, right, which is the principle of sufficient reason, what you could do instead is just talk about necessities, right? So the reason why the universe is fine-tuned is because it's necessary, right? Now, Tim, I know we discussed this before, and I think fine-tuning is a good example. Yeah, Tim never uploads. Okay, yeah, that's okay. So, anyways, so his sort of argument against fine-tuning is basically that any reason that God has to create or like fine-tune the universe is going to be a brute fact. It's either going to be a brute fact or a necessity, right? And because of that, because theism has brute facts and naturalism has brute facts, naturalism is simpler because when you look at the total ontology, you just have natural things that are kind of like brute facts. And then on theism, you have brute facts plus God, right? So when you look at the total ontology of both theism and naturalism is simpler because it has less stuff. It has less commitments, right? And those commitments are kind of like necessary things. Whereas on theism, you still have all those necessary things. In this case, those necessary things are like God's reasons for creating the universe. But then you also have God on top of that. So because of that, then theism is more complex, right? And so what he does is basically show that that theism and naturalism, they both have the same explanatory power, right? But naturalism is simpler because it has less items in the ontology, in the total, ontology of things. And because of that, then naturalism wins at final count. When you figure out, okay, we both agree that all these are either brute facts or necessities. And so, when we kind of compare the two theories, we realize that naturalism wins because it has less things because it has less kind of necessities, right? Now, I guess this is where my disagreements with Oppie come in, right? So I would agree with Oppie that if we are only talking about simplicity and explanatory power, then I think naturalism wins. However, I think there's another important criteria that he didn't go over in his book, which was this new principle, which is called just basically uniformity or simple uniformity. And when simple uniformity, the principle of simple uniformity, it states that for any set of contingent or necessary facts, that there must be a simple root that kind of unifies all those facts, right? And I think when we apply that principle and use it as this sort of like theoretic virtue, then I think theism is actually the winner, because theism is able to unify all those things. So Tim, I just want to help you out here. So what's your thoughts on this sort of new principle? Because I feel like if we apply this principle, right, then all we're really doing is we're taking a naturalistic picture of the world, which is all these like necessities or brute facts, but then we have this like simple root that kind of unifies all those things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I want to go back and add a couple comments of my own, and then tie those into what you just asked. So, yeah, the interesting thing about taking Oppie's framework, given how he approaches arguments and things and theories, he takes the theoretical virtues in which we find in science, and he applies them into, I guess, grand theories, theories of everything, basically everything that somebody would believe. He would take the same theoretical virtues that we would find in science and uses those principles, as you mentioned: simplicity, power, predictability, depth, breadth, as he would say. And through that, well, then we're able to see, okay, how do we evaluate these grand theories? And so I'm perfectly fine doing that too. I think it's really helpful. As you were saying, we're all on board on that part. I think it's really helpful, and I actually think thinking that way is actually should be a way in which all theists should think about these things. So going to unification, yeah, naturalism, as so it's purported, has fewer entities than theism, and since they have, let's say they have equal explanatory power, if naturalism has fewer entities, naturalism is to be preferred as the best theory of reality. But there's a little problem there. And so with this unification, one thing about theories is that the best theories with simplicity are the ones that have simple unifying roots to them. And that's something that we search for in science as well. We posit certain entities to unify a set of facts. So we posit entity X to unify a set of facts Y, for example. And that is what we are saying theism does, and that is to be preferred. Now, I want to add a thing for me on brute facts. I think brute facts should not be preferred. I don't believe that there are any brute facts. I think that given our epistemic limitations, we should go with more lean to the fact that, okay, we might not be able to explain this, but does not mean that's ontologically unexplainable. But naturalism has to posit an array of brute facts, isolated brute facts in which are to account for reality. What theism would do, and they're all brute necessities, by the way. What we're saying with this principle is we're saying, well, all these facts about reality are all linked to one another somehow. And if we add an underlying linking structure to them, we can unify the fundamental aspects of reality by positing just a simple root that unifies all the things. And that's what we're saying Well, that's what theism is doing. So naturalism, you might have a bunch of brute necessities linked to one another, but there's no, and that's it. Like they're just there, and they're all linked by the fact that they're brute. But theism is saying they're all linked together, and they're all unified by a simple root, which makes everything all intelligible, explains everything, and you don't need to posit any unexplainable facts. So for me, once you start positing brute facts, it makes a theory more complex. What we do is we're positing that there's a simple unifying root of a set of facts that is explained. And that becomes the better theory. So for example, we have Newtonian mechanics versus Newtonian gravity versus
Einstein's theory.
Einstein's. Yes, exactly. And Einstein was able to just unify all of space-time, basically, and how gravity would work in space-time under just a simple root. We call that a simple equation. Physicists are looking for a theory, would prefer to find a theory of everything, even to the point where we don't even have to think in terms of laws. This is just how stuff works by positing just one simple entity, and then that can account for why everything works the way it does. So it's not that we have natural facts and then a supernatural fact on theism. It's that theism is the unifying root of all facts about reality. So you have that picture versus disparate, isolated, brute necessities that are not unified whatsoever. They're just interacting with each other brutally, and that's it.
Right.
And so on that picture, you can hardly say that's the simpler theory. And so since we see this kind of unifying principle within science, going off of Oppe's preference of using scientific theoretical virtues, using his own standard, we can actually conclude that theism is simpler. And so, like you were saying, all we're doing is we're taking naturalism and we're just modifying its foundations.
Right.
So
because I don't have to actually dispute anything he says in this book. The only thing I really have to dispute is the conclusion, right? Because all I have to really say is that you're forgetting one important virtue, which is unification, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, and then I also want to point out there's another issue I have, not with the book, but I guess with the sort. If you're going to go the sort of route that the naturalist likes to take, you're going to run into some epistemic problems. We'll get to that later, but yeah, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to add, all we're doing on the whole modifying front is naturalism is going to, at the bedrock, naturalism is going to posit limits. Naturalism has to posit these limits. They have to posit these cutoffs when it comes to the certain fundamental aspects about reality. And what we're doing is we're pretty much like almost kind of helping the naturalists in the sense we're going, well, wait a minute, these are all arbitrarily being posited here. You don't really need to do that. So let's strip it of these arbitrary limits and add this unifying principle to this unifying entity, and that's going to come out looking like theism rather than naturalism.
Right.
But it's interesting because then you kind of get into, well, what's the difference between, what we consider natural and what's not? As we both agree that that distinction really isn't helpful. So we could turn out we're all naturalists, we're all theists, whatever. We're just modifying their foundations.
Right? Because like Oppie, he talks a lot about this thing called an initial singularity, right? And from his
state,
an initial state. So basically, what his idea is, and I'm trying to present his view the best I can because I think he is probably the best defender of naturalism, right? So under that perspective, you would say that the initial singularity is necessary, right? That this thing that existed, in the past, that was the cause of all of reality, that is necessary, but that this thing isn't God, right? That this thing is either like some physical thing, or maybe it's a some like quantum state, or like, you know, something else that's, you know, anything that's not God, right? Anything that's like that has like this ability to create universes, but then that state is necessary, right? Now here's the thing: I don't have a problem with that, right? All you need to really do is point out that, okay, let's take this initial singularity and let's modify it to make it something that is perfect, right? Something that could actually explain things like, you know, morals, things that could explain value, reason, right? Mathematics, consciousness, right? Because you need something that can, again, if you need something that can unify all those things, right? Because if you're going to have initial singularity with these sort of like arbitrary limits to them, right? Or these you know, unexplained limits, right? You're going to run into some problems, because that's not able to unify all the facts about reality. You're still gonna, you know, it may be able to explain like matter, right? It may be able to explain like the existence of, you know, physical reality, but it's not going to be able to explain the existence of like, you know, morality or consciousness, right? So those sort of things, they have different, they're kind of like group facts, or maybe they're like necessary facts about reality, but they're not connected back to that initial source, right? So obviously you're still going to have these sort of like necessary facts kind of just floating out there, right? So all you really need to do is just take the initial state and modify it to something that is perfect, right? And then once you have that sort of like perfection simpliciter, right? That's what I have to call it. Then that's a better hypothesis, because it can unify all those facts. And then, well, I mean, at that point, then that's just theism. But you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
All I was gonna say is that when we look at, you know, that at the bedrock there's this perfect entity, it's basically saying like you have this entity that's complete in every way, devoid of contingency, and that is the best reason that would explain why a causal unfolding from that entity could result in geometry, composition, complexity, etc., because it's emerging from this, what's unfolding from this simple, complete being, no limits, which is what we mean by perfect. It's devoid of any defects and things. If it had defects, then it would have the it would be able to then it would have a possibility to be able to be have no defects. But since it would have no contingencies within its own nature, then, you know, it makes sense that reality would unfold from something like that,
from something that's perfect, right? Something that doesn't have these sort of like arbitrary limits or whatever, and also can, you know, unify all those facts, right? That sort of thing.
And I also want to mention, like, you know, if we posit this initial state, then, you know, we're saying that it has powers, of some sort, but if you press Graham, I heard him saying in one of his conversations that, you know, I don't really have a position on its limits, you know. So when we think of power, like, how much power does the initial state have? And if you start implicitly positing limits, then that makes it just intrinsically more complex. But if it has inexhaustible power, then it makes sense. Then it's able to satisfy predictability and, of course, explanatory power, because then it can just produce effects in any particular shape, form, or fashion. So, and and the reason why I don't think we have to start positing brute facts on this hypothesis of reality is because all reason governed. Because on a naturalistic initial state, you start with impersonalness, imperfection, and things of that sort. But once it's reason-based, then there are, given its perfection, it has, well, all the reasons possible for actualizing a universe in a particular way. And
Right.
so it's just supreme. As Josh would as Josh Rasmussen would say, and it just kind of it's kind of almost liberating, like, okay, this makes sense now.
Right.
So that's what I would say on that.
Yeah, because I mean, when you take the naturalistic hypothesis, right, you have to have an imperfect foundation or something that doesn't have, perfection, right?
If you want to
Something
still
that,
call it natural, yeah.
right, and the problem is you're still going to have these sort of like brute necessities like there in the universe, right? Because I mean, the initial singularity that doesn't predict like consciousness, right? Just if you're taking like the initial singularity as imperfect, well, that's not going to predict consciousness. That's not going to predict morality. So in order for naturalism to work, you have to have those sort of things like other, like those are kind of like brute necessities, right? That are not connected back to the initial source, right? So you're still left with this, issue, right?
Right. And if they want to if they want to explain consciousness by just saying, well, it's just it's just the fundamental physical processes, the psychochemical laws playing out, then that's one way that they could do it. They could then opt in for physicalism, right? But
well,
then
they could do panpsychism, right? That would probably be like the best option for them.
it would be.
Yeah.
It would be if they, because you mentioned earlier, like, well, I can explain matter and stuff. If they just want to keep it, just it all boils down to matter, just these fundamental particles.
Yeah.
Then that would be like a physicalist theory. But then if you can, of course, taking the arguments against physicalism, which I think go through, well, you're gonna have to do something different there. But I mean, you have to give it up to Graham. He's consistent. He is an identity theorist when it comes to consciousness. So that makes sense on that view.
Right.
But we wouldn't agree with that.
Yeah, but another issue that I had, not with the book, but I guess with the sort of, if you want to take it a step further, right? So like I said earlier, I mean, under naturalism, you have to have these sort of brute necessities. You have to have consciousness. Well, maybe not consciousness, but like, let's say morality as a brute fact or necessary, a brute necessity. You have to have the fine tuning as a brute necessity. You have to have all these things as brute necessities, right? Even beauty itself, like you take arguments from beauty, well, you're going to have that as a brute necessity under naturalism, right? So if you can just have all these brute necessities just kind of floating out there without this sort of unifying root to it, well, a solipsist could do the same thing, where they just say, oh, well, all my own experiences are just brute necessities. Like, I don't need to posit a world outside my mind, right? I just need to posit, these brute necessities that I have direct experience of. And it's simple, right? Because I'm not positing, within the total ontology, it's just my own personal experiences, right? So there's nothing beyond my own personal experiences. And all these personal experiences I'm having are all just brute necessities. So because they're brute necessities, there's no need to posit something beyond those brute necessities. And therefore, solipsism would actually be the best hypothesis if we are only taking into account the sort of criteria, right?
And that's my biggest problem with brute facts is like, well, do we have some type of standard in which we measure where we start positing brute facts and where we don't? And that goes in what you're saying. Well, then those are just, again, that leads into arbitrary limits. And at that point, why do you need to posit a brute fact at the initial state? And why don't you just brute necessity at the initial state? And why not posit a brute necessity at your brain state?
Right. Like, what? How come your brain state can't be the initial state? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the issue with that. And so it's like, why not just say all your brain states are necessary and bam, you move on. But of course, there are reasons why, because we think that we can dig deeper. And that's why I think that theism offers the only way for necessities to make sense.
Right.
That these necessities are a metaphysical consequence on something ontologically more ultimate, and which is the foundation. I mean, I've talked to you before, but just to mention out here, in case Scott Clifton ever sees this, we ask, well, what makes something necessary? Well, in naturalism, nothing does. But on theism, the simple unifying root does. And but then you ask, well, what makes that necessary? Well, it's a contradiction to say that the bedrock of, we can go beyond the bedrock of reality. You're going to hit bedrock, and that's going to be the foundations, and everything emerges from the foundations. So that's what I'd say to that. But the reasons why you would say like mathematics, universals, these different things, logic, rules of reason, is because they're unified by something more fundamentally necessary and ultimate than them. So, yeah.
All right. Well, we have some questions if you want to go over them.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's see here. All right. Why couldn't God be the brute fact? Well, I mean, in that case, I mean, God would be necessary, right? So he wouldn't actually be a brute fact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this helps clarify, I guess, the sort of principle. So the simple root has to be something that doesn't have unexplained limits, right? Or at least it has to. It can't be something with unexplained limits, but it also can't be something. It can't be something that is unable to unify. So basically, it has to be something that unifies all the brute facts, right? Or necessary truths about reality. So like if we say that the fine tuning is just necessary, well, you need a kind of an explanation of why that is, right? Now, some people would say, okay, well, what about the root itself, right? Why is that the bedrock, right? And I guess the best answer to that would be that the reason why the root is kind of like the ground layer is because it's perfect. So there's nothing more. Now you can ask, okay, why is it perfect? Well, I don't know. What do you think about that? Because I feel like, is this going to lead to like an infinite regress, or, there's some sort of regress problem of asking, okay, why is it perfect? That sort of, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah. And this is where it gets into, which is at this point, we're getting to a nature in which is independent, self-existent, and self-explanatory. So instead of and self-referential, basically, because we've gotten all the way up to the point in which things need external explanations, but all external explanations are going to eventually terminate into something that doesn't need one. And the reason why I can say that is there's going to be a metaphysical ultimate bottom ground layer of reality, period. And so the next step is to say, well, is that ultimate ground layer purely actual, complete, supreme, perfect, or not? And of course, I think it would make sense that we'd say that.
Right.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Naturalists would agree, like Graham would agree that, like, yes, the foundation has to be necessary, right? That sort of thing. But I think he would kind of say, oh, well, no, it doesn't have to be like supernatural, or it doesn't have to be, it's going to have some sort of like limit, right? What do you think about that? Because I feel like if we just take like the quantum state, for example, right? Even then, like, even if you have like an infinite quantum state that has no arbitrary limits in that sense, well, the question is, does that quantum state actually explain consciousness or morality? And if the question's, well, no, it doesn't, there's something else that explains it, well, then we're still left with the same problem, right? You're still going to have that sort of kind of these brute necessities flowing around. You're still going to have that sort of problem, and therefore, you're going to violate the PSU in that case, right? So whatever the ground layer is, it can't have arbitrary limits. It has to be necessary, but it also has to explain things like morality. It has to explain all those sort of things, right? So
Exactly. And I would say that the interesting thing about the PSU is what we were thinking is, this is really going to help out the gap problem. The gap problem right now is the only part of one of the main problems in cosmological arguments that has not had the most time dedicated to it. And this is going to really, really help shrink that gap, because it's going to be an extension of the PSR, was kind of the thinking here, and so, stage one of these arguments is going to be using something like the principle of sufficient reason.
That's what they defend it pretty well in this book, the
Exactly.
PSR. So,
and so that book is basically going to be, without a doubt, okay,
yeah,
stage one,
that's good.
complete. We're good there. But then stage two, using something like the PSU, we can go, okay, well, we have these explanations for these facts. Now let's unify these facts in something that's in a simple root, and that's going to shrink the gap more, because then we're applying the PSU to the metaphysical, because I think the PSU is something that's implicitly affirmed in science. So we apply it to the physical. It has practical application. I mean, if you really want to get practical, we can talk about how, I one time talked about, every house has a
water system.
Yeah, a water system, a water source. And the reason why there's water in various places within the house is because it's all unified by one source, that being the water source. So it has practical value, it has scientific value, and then we can apply it, going to the highest level, we can apply it to metaphysics. And I think if we do that in conjunction with the gap problem, then it shrinks the gap more.
Right. Because then we're able to unify consciousness, morality, value, reason, right? So we're able to take everything about reality and put it all together. So
exactly. Yeah. And that would just a grand theory of everything. Yeah. And so I think that is that's why it is so helpful. And at the same time, this is also to help naturalists as well, because this is a theoretical. We also affirm that this is a theoretical virtue as well.
Mm-hmm.
So unification is is a huge theoretical virtue.
I think it's the most important one, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I don't see how the others make sense without it, right? In order for simplicity to make sense, well, you need a simplifying unification, right? In order for explanatory power to make sense, you need some sort of unification. Otherwise, again, we can go back to what I was talking about earlier, which is the whole solipsism problem, which is, well, if we're just going off simplicity and explanatory power, well, then I could just say my brain states are necessary, right? And that's not really, I mean, yeah, it's an explanation, but it's not really unifying, right? In that sort of way. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. Let's move on to another
all right
comment here.
Yeah, I guess let's go back to earlier what I was saying, which is God's reasons for creating the universe would be brute facts, but yeah, I mean, that would pretty much be the basic idea. Okay. What do you think of Pfizer's renderation of the composition argument? I actually, okay, I'm going to be completely honest. I have never read the composition argument. What do you, I mean, yeah, I agree. I would agree with Pfizer that God cannot be compositional, right? So he has to be simple, right? And I think, I mean, what do you think, Tim? I mean, I feel like the principle would actually require divine simplicity, or at least some version of it.
Yeah, the same as PSU, the methodology composition argument. Well, yeah, I would agree, because if one of our facts is, well, we have we're including these facts that contain composition.
Yeah.
Then you can get composition of any type, of any form, from something in which doesn't have it. that doesn't, it itself isn't composed, is non-composite, because the logic and the reasoning behind these arguments is that, well, composite things do have an explanation because there's a reason why the things are the parts are arranged in a particular way, and they can always be arranged in a different way.
Right.
So, but you can get composition like that from something in which is devoid of it, and is something that so that's what I would say. And the connection to the PSU there would be, well, if that's the part of the facts, and that's part of the set of facts Y, for example, that we're trying to unify, then it makes more sense to unify in something that doesn't have the composition, because then you're just gonna take that reasoning back in, that logic back in there, apply it, and go, well, that's gonna have to have more explanation for why its arrangement is there. And then that gets into arbitrary limits, because it's then why are you positing in this unifying particular composition? And so let's just get rid of that. And it's basically what happens when you apply to the metaphysical level.
Right.
And so I do agree that it entails simplicity. Reality will inevitably proceed from simplicity, as I would say.
Right. Right. Couldn't we just say that God? Well, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the whole point, right? Where we can take a naturalistic hypothesis, right, a theory, like they have all these like brute facts or brute necessities that are kind of like floating out there. You know, they say that, you know, morality is necessary, or the applicability of the universe is necessary, or fine tuning is necessary, right? Or beauty, religious experience. Like I can go on and on, but like basically, yeah, what we're really basically doing is we're taking a naturalistic hypothesis and we're saying, okay, let's unify all these facts into one simple root. And that's, I mean, yeah, it's theistic naturalism, but I mean, you know, that's the best way we can go.
So. Yeah, whatever. Reality is reality. So,
all right. Do you think it's more probable the PSU would point towards a sustaining or temporal? I think this goes back to whether or not the foundation is timeless, right? I don't know if it is, because there's debates between classical theists and neoclassical theists about whether or not God is timeless, at least currently. I think it's more probable that he is timeless, right? But the principle doesn't imply one or the other, so it's open to like a neoclassical theist could accept it as well as a classical theist, right? So it leaves open the idea. I guess it doesn't really specify what model of God we have to accept. Maybe divine. I mean, we do have to accept some version of divine simplicity, but we don't have to accept like the hardcore version, which is like that there is no distinctions in God's nature. I think, well, I don't hold to that version of divine simplicity, but I think it would imply, the only thing it really would imply in regards to like modeling God is, yes, it would imply some version of divine simplicity, but it doesn't specify if classical theism or neoclassical theism are correct. What do you think what do you think, Tim?
Yeah, no. I would agree, because then I would say that's introducing that's introducing unnecessary commitments into the principle. But this is interesting, which is Craig's view, which I would say is what I lean towards, which is Craig would say God's existence, the first phase of God's existence is timeless. God exists mainly timelessly, but then without creating the temporal without creating temporal reality, and then subsequent to that creation, a phase transition happens where then God extrinsically becomes temporal. So a neoclassical theist can accept that God doesn't change intrinsically, but can change extrinsically. And so there's two phases of God's life, one timeless and then one temporal. There's why I think this is cool, is that once the causal unfolding happens of physical reality, that would that would unfold from a timeless being, and then but once that happens, the phase switches and the being is then divinely temporal, and that is perfectly fine because taking weak panentheism, I would take a immanent view of the foundations, and given creation ex deo, I think that would also make sense that divine temporality would be something. So I actually think Craig's view makes sense of that, because the PSU would get you to a timeless being, yes, but then given its act of creation, extrinsic changes can happen, but it doesn't entail those things. That's what I would say.
You think if you had a completely simple model of God, then it follows? Well, I mean, pure actuality. So pure actuality, what we mean by pure actuality is actually not the pure actuality that Fraser talks about. So I think this is important to clarify. So what we mean by pure actuality is something that has no unexplained limits or defects, right? So basically, pure actuality is just something that has no limitations, unexplained limitations, right?
Yeah, it'd be devoid of any contingencies,
right,
etc. And that they would consider those potentialities. So, but I mean, I can also affirm that too. But that's pretty much what we mean.
Right. You cannot be in any state temporal. That's interesting.
I mean, this is where this is why I'm not me being not a classical theist.
I'm not a classical theist either.
I would just say that God can extrinsically change. So
right.
Temporality and timelessness are things that can contain extrinsically. So yeah.
And Aristotle. Oh, yeah. No, yeah. Actually, so actuality. I actually did a video on this, which is pure actuality. Well, if you go to my foundation series video number 3, I do talk about the distinction between actuality and potentiality. So, yes, God would not have any fundamental potentiality, right? Because he is pure actuality, right?
Yeah.
And he's pure actuality by being necessary. So, because God has to exist, right? Then he would be purely actual in that sense, right? And then God could, of course, actualize other worlds, right? And I think that way is kind of helpful, right? Because even if you have like an infinite amount of universes, well, they don't actually become actual until something actualizes them, right? And I think when you think about it like that, then it really helps kind of clarify at least stage 1 contingency arguments. But
yeah, because
yeah,
we take we attribute to the divine properties, power, knowledge, goodness, all those different things, and since God exists in a purely actual way, then all those things would be inexhaustible, no limits. So yes, God would exist in a purely actual way. But of course, getting into some classical theist stuff, also timelessness would affirm that God is, well, it brings in like things like eternalism. So God would coexist with.
Oh, I think that's weird.
What?
We both, I think, buffered out. I don't know what happened. Let me see. My internet's fine, so I'm not sure if it was. What were you saying? So you might have to repeat what he just said. Tim.
What?
Yeah, you might have to repeat what you just said because you zoomed out.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
No, I was just saying, like, given God's attributes, they would all exist in a purely actual way, so they'd all be inexhaustible. So that's really all we're saying here.
Mm-hmm.
But go to the next comment here. He's said something. to God would have potential change in nature and its pure timelessness. That's the potential nullifies actually. Well, I said that's not an intrinsic change. That's an extrinsic change.
Yeah.
So without creation, timelessness, but subsequent to creation, because the reason why I would have to, if I wanted to affirm what a Thomist would affirm, I would say that, well, God would have to stand in no relation to creation, and that's how God stays timeless. But I don't affirm that. I don't think standing in relation to something introduces complexity. So I don't need to do that. So he extrinsically changes. One phase of God's life is timeless, and another phase subsequent to creation is divinely temporal.
It also depends on what view of time you take. So, like, I don't hold the A theory. I don't think that time is objective in that sort of way, right? So God, I guess you could say that time exists within God, right? But then God's able to come into time, let's say if, as a human or, you know, whatever. But yeah.
Yeah.
I guess one last thing I want to mention before we close off is that when you look at the fundamental set of commitments that that theism and naturalists hold, theism would actually be simpler in that sense, right? Because you have these fundamental set of commitments, and those fundamental set of commitments explain all the other facts, right? In this case, you know, those fundamental set of commitments are basically just perfection, something that's perfect, that kind of makes sense of consciousness, makes sense of morality, makes sense of fine-tuning. That's those sort of things, right? So those are a fundamental set of commitments. But then you have naturalism, which just doesn't have that fundamental set of commitments, right? It has all these brute facts. So when you're talking about fundamental set of commitments, then theism wins. And I think that's probably the best way to look at simplicity, which is how many fundamental set of commitments is each theory holding to, right? And in this case, the naturalist has to have a bunch of fundamental set of commitments, right? Because you have to say that fine-tuning is necessary, but then you also have to say that the initial state is necessary, that morality is necessary, reason is necessary, mathematics is necessary. So you have to have all these, like, you know, fundamental set of commitments, like this wide range of them, right, that are just kind of there. But they don't have something more simple, right? So that is their fundamental set of commitments. So they have more fundamental set of commitments, whereas the theist just says that the only fundamental set of commitments that the theist has would be perfection, right? Because perfection is the thing that explains all those other things, right? So when you compare naturalism, you have naturalism, which is a bunch of fundamental set of commitments, and you have theism, which a very little set of fundamental commitments. Then theism wins at the end of the day, right? So I don't know. What do you think about that, Tim?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that's what I think. You know, that would be the simplest account of reality. Right. You know, that's what the foundations would be. So it goes back to, we're just modifying certain parts of naturalism. You know, taking the initial state, and things, and since we get this is what I was thinking when you were saying that. Since we get a foundation which actualizes based on reason. If you say, well, you know, if you introduce like problem of evil or problem of imperfection in creation, we can say, well, since the foundations are actions, choices, and things, well, choices would involve that, are reason based, then this foundation, this unifying simple root, would have reasons for actualizing things in a particular way in which conscious agents might experience certain things. Because people would say, well, what do we expect from a perfect foundation? We would expect perfection everywhere, and so I would just leave that in the sense of, well, now things are reason based. These are reason governed, and you have reasons, and then that's when all the theodicies come in.
Yeah.
without even getting into them. But
okay, so the last question. Do you have a so well actually yes I do. Um, this is an argument from possible unification. So I'm gonna try my best to. So the first premise lays out what the principle actually is, and then the second premise goes over some sort of like weaker version, which is a principle of possible unification. So premise one, the simple unification principle: for any set of things, whether contingent or necessary, that exist, it is possible for there to be a simple root that unifies the contingent or necessary facts. Premise two, a possible unification, which is that it is possible for there to be a unification of contingent and necessary facts by a simple root. Premise three, from a possible simple unification to the possibility of a necessary simple unification, if 1 and 2 are true, then it is possible that there is a necessary simple root that unifies all facts. Premise four, therefore it is possible that there is a necessary simple root that unifies all facts, root and necessary facts. Premise five, from the possibility to actuality. So this goes into S5 modal logic, which is basically that if it is possible that there is a necessary simple root that unifies all facts, then there is a necessary simple root that unifies all facts. And therefore, there is a necessary simple root that unifies all facts. So I guess premise five is really just S5 logic, which is that if you accept the possibility that there is a necessary simple root, right, then it would just follow that there is a simple root, right? Because if it's necessary or if it's possible that it's necessary, then you can logically show like there's a logically, I guess S5 logic is pretty much shows that to be the case, right? So I guess the only real issue with that sort of argument would be you need to show it's possible that there is a necessary simple root, right? And once you can show that, then once you can show that it's possible for there to be a necessary simple root, then there actually is a necessary simple root, and then at that case, then you can kind of deduct, okay, what is the simple root, right? I mean, me and Tim already discussed this before. I think the simple root is perfection. I don't know what a naturalistic simple root would look like because again, a simple root has to unify all facts. And naturalism just doesn't have that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that the only real candidate, at least that I can think of, would be something that's perfect that is the simple root. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, we reached. Okay. Well, thanks you guys for watching. If you have any questions, we're not going to ask them now, but you can ask them in the comments or you can email me. And again, if you showed up late, you can rewatch this video to kind of get what we were talking about earlier. But I want to thank Tim for coming on. And I also want to thank, I know he's not here, but Graham Moppy, because if I didn't read his work, we would have never came up with the principle. So I encourage everyone, if they're a theist, if they believe in God, read the atheist literature, because I've actually learned a lot of things from reading atheists, especially analytic atheists. Like, don't watch YouTube atheists, don't watch, Dawkins, ignore all that stuff. Read the atheist literature, because once you read the literature, you're going to learn a lot. I don't know. What do you think, Tim? That's what I think.
Oh yeah. No, that's where the most value comes out, because the analytic philosophers of religion who are atheists actually, the way that they approach how they look at theism is they actually take it seriously. And then they're able to, with taking it seriously, they're actually able to formulate good arguments or responses worth listening to and considering. The online types and atheist personalities that you see don't. And so you can't really learn anything from them because they're not even taking the other side seriously. I want to shout out Real Atheology. There's a recent tweet by them that said that they think that that theism is alongside one of the most rigorous intellectual contenders. So they actually pay their respects to theism, even though they're not theists. Read people like that, because you're going to get the best responses from people like that.
All right. Well, I'm going to close it off now. Thank you guys for watching, and have a nice day.